welcome to a full house. I'm Howard Lerner. I'm the Executive Director of the Environmental Law and Policy Center. Thank you for joining us today, and this should be interesting. This is the second of a three-part series being jointly pulled together by our good colleagues at the Metropolitan Planning Council, Mary Sue Barrett sitting right over there, by our good friends at the Shared Use Mobility Center. Sharon Feigen is right over here. We are excited about these opportunities to both learn a lot about the rapid changes you'll hear about from the panelists. We want to inspire some dialogue on policies, policy choices, impacts, urban design, as there are more driverless cars that are moving around Chicago and the surrounding area, and solutions. This is about talking, learning, thinking. It's moving toward what are the solutions, what are the policies that make sense for Chicago and our region as we grapple with both the opportunities and the challenges, and we're not alone in doing that. Today's session will focus on how autonomous vehicles can inspire transformative changes in transportation, and particularly the urban landscape. You know, as people are thinking about here, what happens downtown when there are thousands upon thousands of driverless cars circling around the loop? How should that be managed? How should that be handled? What are the upsides? What are the problems we need to deal with? How can we project that in advance and think about it now so we're designing proactive solutions rather than responding to problems as they come up? That's what the panelists will talk about today. Mary Wisniewski is hosting this and moderating the panel. Hopefully, you know Mary. I've known Mary through the Sun-Times and many things before. She is now the Tribune's transportation columnist, reporter. She writes the Getting Around column, which we all like and read. Mary moderated the first panel discussion a few weeks ago at Metropolitan Planning Council, did an excellent job a few weeks ago. It was November. Time flies when you're having a good time. We move today to recuse Administrator Scott Pruitt from the Clean Power Plan proceedings as having an unalterably closed mind. Things are moving fast, all right? Mary did such a fine job, we asked if she'd do it again. Thank you, Mary, for moderating and doing this, and Mary will introduce the panelists. Thank you for coming for what should be a very interesting session. Let's go.
Okay, I think this is a rare day because this is one of the few days in the history of the Republic that where everyone is talking about infrastructure today, because it might actually it's expected to come up in the State of the Union. The President's infrastructure plan might actually be released in its details in the next few weeks, and then everyone's going to be wondering how is this going to be funded, what's it going to look like. So everyone's really concerned about this right now. And the idea of what automated vehicles are going to do with this is really exciting. One of the reasons that I like to cover transportation so much is it affects how we live. It affects what our built environment is like. It affects how we get around. It affects our lives. It affects the air that we breathe. You know, the autonomous vehicles are going to do things to our lives that, you know, it's very difficult to predict right now, which is why we have these three smart people here to help us understand what it's going to look like. So I'm going to introduce everyone in turn, and then we're going to start making presentations, and then we're going to take questions afterwards. So starting off right here on my right is Kelly Coiner, who is the Senior Fellow at the Center for Regional Analysis at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. And she teaches AV Policy and Planning. And she is the CEO founder of Me3, which is helping cities and campuses and transit agencies and airports and others navigate testing and deployment of autonomous vehicles. She also writes for the Mobility Lab blog as Mobility Mama. So that's Kelly. And next on our right is Marshall Brown, who is founder of Marshall Brown Projects Architecture and Urban Design Studio. and is associate professor at the Illinois Institute of Technology, College of Architecture in Chicago. And he creates visions for the future of urban environments and the integration of architecture and infrastructure and landscape, which is such a big part of, what is Chicago history. So really excited to hear from him. And last but not least, we have Christopher Hall, who's the urban strategy leader in the city design practice at Skidmore, Owings and Merrill in Chicago. And he's worked in cities and regions around the globe on implementing transformative master planning and urban design projects. So those are our panelists, and we want to get started with Kelly to talk about what you think this is going to do for us.
Thank you. So Marshall and Chris are going to talk about how they see the vision of this playing out, and I'm going to do what I usually do as Mobility Mama and take my own take on this, which is that this is not so much about the transformation that we are inspired by, but how do we get inspired about the kinds of transformation that we can make in the city landscape. I had a lot of titles there, and that's sort of a common thing, but the thing that I'm most proud of is that I am a transportation practitioner. I have run operations, I have done planning and funding. I've also run the country's largest research program in transportation through the U.S. Department of Transportation and the Volpe Center. And I think that what I really want you to focus on is thinking about the change that you want to create and the vision that you want to have in the city and what you can do now. So my first message to you is this is urgent. This is now. This is not something that we need to look at in 5 years or 10 years or in 25 years. And it's not just about driverless cars. It's about autonomous mobility, which is something that is very, very different. If you need some things to help get people's attention, there are some implications that are a little different than what we normally think of. I have a colleague who has just done a revenue analysis for the Port of New York, New Jersey, on what the impacts on the revenues of the Port Authority would be when we have full autonomous. And that actually got people's attention a lot more than thinking about what the deployment schedule is. That's not the most visionary way to think about what it might mean for the city. And so what I'd like to talk about are sort of three other areas. One is equity issues, and I think that's at the top of the list. We need to understand what those issues are. You need to think about what place you want to make Chicago as a result of AV. And then thirdly, we'll come to the sort of heart of the matter, which is thinking about what the vision for transportation looks like. So when I say understand the equity issue, I've done a lot of these kinds of forums in the last year, and invariably, equity issues are framed in terms of what AVs will cause in terms of problems with equity. Who will get served, who will lose their jobs, who will not be able to use it because they either can't get in it with their wheelchair or who won't be able to access it because they can't afford to pay. And those are all extremely important equity issues. But when we envision the transformation that we can have, we need to look at the other side of the coin along with it. And the starting place is that autonomous offers a tremendous opportunity and access and accessibility to millions of people who are not autonomous themselves now because they cannot drive. And there are things that we need to be building in right now to make sure that that works. It's partly about being ADA accessible and being able to put a wheelchair in. We don't have a ADA compliant autonomous vehicle on the market now, and we can use the drivers that we have at the policy level to make sure we have that. But we can go so much further. We can design the vehicles to be universally designed, and we can also make sure that the person who's cognitively impaired or who's visually impaired or mobility impaired can get to the service. My friend Joe Coughlin, who's at the Aging Lab, calls this the issue of the last 50 feet. Because it is not just the last mile that matters when we're talking about accessibility. It's how do you get to the curb and get in the vehicle. Similarly, The workforce issue is an important one to take a look at. It's a real hot button issue as people worry about what the impact will be, and we might as well just be honest. It will be a disproportionate impact on one group of people. People who drive buses, people who drive trains, people who drive trucks. And we need to figure out when that impact comes and how we're going to retrain or reposition. But it also doesn't mean that we're going to have a flat-out loss of jobs. Those jobs ought to be transformed. We talk about autonomous vehicles as being driverless, as though there is no one in the vehicle that has a human service component to it. And I think that we need to take a very hard look at how do we work through those issues. And then I'm going to suggest that another key equity issue is the issue of public transportation. Because if what happens as a result of ride-hailing and AVs is that we undercut our public transportation system, then we have a fail on what the positive transformation might look like. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the make your own place piece of it. I think we have some other people who are much more skilled in talking about that, but since the sort of my focus is what do we need to do now to create that space, I think that we need to be thinking about the sort of decisions we make about infrastructure and the way that AVs are introduced into the environment in a way that promote the kind of cityscape that we want in terms of walkability and pedestrian access. And we need to be mindful of how we have safety within the environment, but as I said, others can talk more about what that total place looks like. Now I want to talk about the stuff that's close to Mobility Mama's heart, which is the transportation piece of it. 4 weeks ago, I formed a new entity called Mobility E3, or Me3. And it was really to do this kind of work in the city environment, to work with cities and communities on AV deployment and bringing it to scale. And as my partner, Corey Clothier, who's here today, says, you know, it's not about the car. It's about a whole new vision of where we look. And the work that we're focused on is what some of you may have heard as urban speed autonomous vehicles or low speed autonomous vehicles. I'd like to rename that as community speed autonomous vehicles. Those are the very first pilot of any autonomous vehicle in the country was a low speed vehicle at Fort Bragg. Corey was the lead on that pilot. And it was in 2013. So I challenge you to go back and find Waymo or Uber or anybody else who was doing a pilot at that point in time. And it was designed to meet a real transportation need, which I think is another key thing that we need to keep in mind. Pilots are good, demos are good, they're important in terms of moving innovation along, but as we think about making this be something that is useful in the city, we want to tie it to a transportation need. And in this case, it was getting people to the facilities that they needed service from, Wounded Warriors, and figuring out a way to make sure that they were actually able to keep those commitments. The good news is that there's not such a high demand for that service at Fort Bragg now, and those vehicles have been repurposed somewhere else. So looking at what real transportation needs are, the logical use cases are things that also fit with the equity issues that we talked about. So how do we give people who live in mobility deserts access? How do we make sure that we're feeding transit and not starving transit by bringing in ridership? Where would it be appropriate to have circulators that move people in a campus environment? Be that the airport, or be that a development, or be that a healthcare sort of facility? And what sort of infrastructure do we need to support that? And one thing about the low-speed vehicle is that certainly some infrastructure enhancements with putting in sensing technology and the like can help, but it's not the kind of investment that we need for the higher speed sort of thing. So the question I always get asked is, do I have to get to 5G to get there? No, you don't. And there's a lot of innovation that is going on around sort of how do we make these work in that environment. So I don't want to be I don't want to say that, I don't want to be the pedestrian, as it were, in all senses of the word about this. There's a lot of room for imagination here. And let me just sort of say that a lot of the imagination is centered around the vehicle design. I think that this is an opportunity to really reinvent our vision of the vehicle and the systems. We don't even yet quite have the words for it, right? So we used to think about the horseless carriage. We opened today talking about driverless cars. We like to talk about automated mobility systems, and what do we mean when we're talking about that? We're talking about buses that carry 20 passengers. Transdev, who's located here in Chicago, is working on the iCrystal, which would be that type of solution. There are several others that are looking at shuttles that are in the 5 to 15 passenger side. But I invite you to be much more imaginative to that. In fact, I've been challenged to be more imaginative to that. I had some colleagues say, well, what about an autonomous bike? And I dismissed them as that was ridiculous. But there's an inventor who's put together a really interesting concept around a recumbent bike that's very cheap to put in place. It would be a very low-speed vehicle, and it would be a truly personal rapid transit option. There are producers who have already put out automated wheelchairs, which would really revolutionize the way we think about personal mobility for someone who's mobility impaired, where they would be able to go from another vehicle or not even use the other vehicle and move not just in an airport environment, but move themselves on the streets. It is a truly exciting time, and I think that it was apropos that you pointed out that today was a big infrastructure day, because my sort of vision about AVs is that lets us talk about all the important issues that we need to talk about in transportation and in the American city. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Chicago. So, a lot of the public discussion has been, I think, colored by a great deal of fear and uncertainty about our collective future in this period of technological transformation. And so that's the context in which my and my team's work has occurred. A couple of years ago, we assembled an interdisciplinary team at IIT of transportation planner Jack Guthman, a landscape architect Ron Henderson, social scientist Laura Filano, and a transportation engineer Lily Dew, and myself, an architect, probably the least qualified of the bunch to actually talk about this issue. And our goal was to try to clarify the issues around the topic of driverless cities, so-called driverless cities, and envision some possible futures. So we sort of declared our mission as, as looking into how we could transform 20th century transportation infrastructure into 21st century human infrastructure. So this is an image of, so last November, the New York Times, many of you probably saw this, New York Times dedicated their entire technology issue to the topic. I did an interview with them, and they featured this diagram, which you see kind of chopped on the right, or a version of this diagram, which I know is too small. I'm going to zoom into it for you. It's a mind map, which is a diagram that's used to organize thinking around particular topics or problems. So we call this the driverless city mind map. And basically what you see highlighted in white are 4 spaces of opportunity, which we identified to help organize our thinking, but also to help other people organize their thinking. And the 4 spaces of opportunity were street space, parking space, commuter space, and delivery space. And then each space, so zooming in a little bit, each space becomes a conceptual container for other issues, which are then organized by scale. And so we made a lot of different kinds of things. So diagrams, also some devices, and I'll show you a brief excerpt from a video. The challenge was really, how do we write the future? And I think that's the ongoing challenge. How do we write the future? Often the question is posed to me, and I'm sure many of you, what will driverless cars, what will connected and autonomous vehicles do to our city? And I always respond, that's the wrong question. The question is, what kind of urban spaces do we want to live in and work in, and how do we leverage the technology to get there? So we invented this thing that we call the Driverless City Scenario Builder. It's a set of 100 double-sided tokens. Each one is a walnut ring with a bronze core. And we developed this device in collaboration with a Chicago industrial designer named Martin Kastner. Some of you, any of you fancy folks out there who have eaten at Alinea or had some fancy cocktails at the Aviary have used some of his strange implements. He's a brilliant individual. Each token has a tilted bevel that enhances the interaction, that allows for easier selecting, shuffling, flipping, spinning. They're kind of semi-precious objects. It's not a game. It's not a game. It works actually more like tarot or fortune telling. So it provokes a conversation between what we call a traveler and a navigator. A traveler who has a question about, how they will get their kids to school, or, how they will live in their local environment. And then the navigator who uses the tokens to then structure a story and a conversation.
Platooning vans disperse regionally to irrigate markets with fresh produce. At the same time, electronics, furniture, and even autonomous vehicles produced through the vast global supply chain are also ubiquitous. The need for social connection and the demand for hyper-specialized goods has assured the viability of in-place retailing throughout the region. Purchases made in person can be located and transferred from a truck house and delivered within minutes or hours to any location. Persistent trade imbalances with China and Southeast Asia have led to networked markets for recycling. UPCSX fills empty containers with waste products for return trips. The consequent closing of landfills has therefore become a significant planning challenge for public authorities hoping to recoup some value from those sites. With the ability to detect potential collisions, including wildlife, from long distances, roadkill has become largely a thing of the past, thus contributing to overpopulation of certain species. In response to homeowners' complaints about deer, coyotes, and other large mammals, the states of Illinois, Michigan, and Indiana relaxed regulation and opened new areas of hunting throughout the territory. Many former drivers and warehouse workers have developed seasonal hunting and trapping services. They supply on-demand food with fresh meats, catering to the public's appetite for regionally specific foods. The popularity of locally sourced cuisine contrasted greatly with the nearly complete outsourcing of most other forms of production. The vast tracts of warehouses abandoned by industrial property developers and third-party logistics companies have also proven to be fertile ground for many gray market industries. These vast landscapes of exchange, born in the 19th century, had served their purpose and now needed a new role to play in the 21st century. Once separated from our cities and hidden from view, they became testing grounds for new forms of production and civic life.
So that's just a little taste of the kind of work that we've been doing. Again, as I was saying, we're at the beginning of a decades-long transformation. And at the Driverless City Project, we're trying to provide social scenarios, technical solutions, and infrastructural strategies for envisioning some of these futures. Thank you.
So I'm glad some of the other speakers have talked about how big a choice we're actually facing. And I think one of the important things is this is not about an accumulation of kind of technical solutions and small-scale decisions, we're at the biggest point in our transportation history since probably 1910, 1920, when we decided to shift from horse and steam engine to car and aeroplane. And the impact is potentially as significant. I think this is a time that we kind of want to be intentional, that we've got to make big choices, because we're potentially looking at an entirely new transportation system that can shape cities and future cities around the world. When Ellen first approached me, she said, well, come and talk about what kind of work you're doing. You know, tell us about your projects. And I guess they break down into a couple of different categories. What we're seeing is at the very largest scale in Asia, cities are, and particularly in China, are anticipating autonomous vehicles. And they're asking us to think about what the framework of cities would be within that context. The interesting thing is that those cities are also going through a period of massive investment in transit and national transit and high-speed rail and those systems as well. So it's not autonomous vehicles alone, it's part of a bigger story. What we're also seeing is here in the US, working with major developers on large sites, some of which are in this region, in this city, there's increasing interest in how do we connect into other systems and autonomous vehicles as being part of that. In many cases, that's because the sites are actually ex-industrial sites. They didn't have transit. They may have had freight routes, but they didn't have transit per se. So it's almost like a neighborhood shuttle service or a campus shuttle approach. Then what we're also seeing in our work down in Phoenix, in Tempe, with the city, where Uber vehicles, self-driving vehicles, with people still sitting behind the steering wheel, but you see the hands kind of lifting off them quite a lot, are circling the city, really testing the technology, real time on city streets. But what we're also seeing is that's a city that's massively committed to transit and is extending a streetcar and has introduced a light rail system, which has been hugely successful. So there's a huge array of kind of activity out there. And I guess one of the things that always comes up when we come into this discussion is we assume everybody is thinking the same thing about autonomous vehicles. You say the two words, oh yeah, I know what you mean. Actually, there are enormous range of things that people are building into their thinking. They're thinking about the vehicle. Oh, I won't have to drive. I'm liberated from steering this vehicle. The second level is an assumption of ride sharing as a key component of that. We're all going to have fewer cars because we'll be ride sharing autonomous vehicles. Okay, well, that's another layer. Then the next step in this is the assumption that we can manage traffic across the entire region, that there'll be a centralized steering mechanism that's picking our routes. And that's really autonomous. That means we don't decide where we go or how we decide where we go. We don't decide how we get there or what route we're taking. There's data God somewhere who is steering all of us at the same time and allocating what the best route is. The question is it the best route for everybody? Or is it the best route for you in particular, and maybe for your premium best route service? So where's the priority come in? And then the other component people often talk about is how all of the pods will join together and essentially become a supercharged high occupancy vehicle lane, which will barrel through the city. And I think it's important that we're clear with ourselves. What are we talking about? Are we talking about kind of a drop-off service, door to door? Or are we talking about a system that works across the whole region? I think we also have to ask ourselves kind of if we want the fully loaded version, what that's going to take. And it really will take a level of government cooperation. We started talking about Chicago and Chicago's downtown. But if my autonomous vehicle is coming across 6 municipalities to get here, all of those need to buy into it as well. And it has to be a single unified system. So how does that work? And how practical is that given our kind of level of governmental fragmentation? And is it more practical in places where you have a much more kind of top-down, centralized governmental system as opposed to a much more kind of pluralistic system? So I think there are real questions about kind of how this rolls out kind of as a complete system, and it has to be complete to get the gains which people are already talking about. I think the analogy here, actually there is a place that's got a lot of autonomous vehicles already. O'Hare Airport. Most planes are actually landing themselves, and there's a safety guy on board. So that works really well. We know how well that works. It's kind of marshalling traffic from around the globe, which all centers on the same spot. Now, if a crop duster flies in from Iowa and is not part of the system and is manually controlled and lands on the main runway at 5 in the evening, what's that do to the system? So I think there's going to be a real question at some point, what's the tipping point? We have a hybrid system. How do we integrate between the managed system and then the kind of individual decisions and people who don't want to be part of that managed system? And in places like, dare we say, Singapore or kind of smaller city-states, you can kind of have this top-down system, but how do we get there in a much more kind of pluralistic society? I think the other questions that come into play as well are about kind of just will people shift to micropods? The role of car in display in terms of sending messages about our class, our race, our gender, our wealth. All of those things are incredibly embedded. A car is it's a symbolic cultural product as much as it is a means of transportation. Otherwise, we'd all be driving to ourselves or around town. We have other things that, it's a cultural product, so that kind of plays into it. So I think, that all kind of mixes together to kind of suggest that to get to the promised land, we kind of need to understand what that promised land is and understand practicalities of getting there. I think there is a bigger question, though. It's not just, do we drive the way we do today, or do we go to autonomous vehicle system? Transit and the entire mobility and transportation network is on the table. And I think we're not in kind of how do you put it, a steady state where we're making a choice between a much more efficient car system versus the car system we have today. Transportation is also massively advancing. So, from my own experience in London, kind of the level of investment and technology that's gone into upgrading the rail systems and the tube systems and the bus systems, in all the things you can't see. There's new cars, there's new carriages, there's new stations. But the signaling and the traffic management is the biggest transformation over the last 10 years. And the same technologies which are allowing the possibility of autonomous vehicles are also massively upgrading the capacity of the transit system just by managing throughput. And new vehicles and systems are also, have the capacity to deliver 1,500 people every 90 seconds into a station. Can autonomous vehicles do that? Can they kind of really deliver on a practical level if everybody's in their own individual vehicle, kind of the questions of loading, unloading? So I don't think we should kind of talk about this as I think there's an inevitability about some level of autonomy working into the system. But I think we have to ask ourselves, what kind of transportation system do we want in 30 or 50 years' time? Because we're at that inflection point, and we've got to kind of look at all of the modes while we're talking about this. Thanks.
Okay, thank you all so much. I'm going to get the fun of it, asking the first couple of questions, and then we'll be able to bring it out to the audience. The first thing I wanted to ask about is, we talk about, Chris, you talked about intentionality, and that this is this is like one of the most transformative times in transportation since 1910. And I had this vision of, Daniel Burnham and company, sitting in a room like this, maybe even this room, thinking about, planning Wacker Drive, which is a two-level drive, which is a very revolutionary thing at the time, which was planning for something that was coming. It was coming for the automobile revolution was coming, and they were able to get together and make these changes to the cityscape in order to accommodate that new form of transportation. But I wondered if I could ask you and ask the other panelists, how much concern do you have that the governments that we have now, which are so divided, are not going to be able to come up with the funding to make the changes needed, and are not going to be able to come up with the consensus that's needed to make this into something good rather than something nightmarish? And we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think there's huge variety and huge differences between, if you look around the globe, the cities with medieval cores and then versus kind of an American grid-based system. with its wide boulevards and kind of arterial streets, and then the new cities that are being planned in the major growth locations around the globe. And I think we have to think about this all as a system, because the vehicles that will be manufactured, because there's only going to be 4 or 5 vehicle manufacturers on the planet, and it's also, the design's going to be pretty similar, we've got to think about kind of how all of that works and fits together. I think the question for us also is, what's the implication for the pedestrian, the individual, and their experience on the street? But I think to your point about, if you think about this city, how much of the public realm is actually layered on by new developments. So, the completion of the Riverwalk has kind of had significant contributions from development downtown. Millennium Park as a transportation facility, as a station and parking facility, how much of that was paid for through kind of TIF mechanisms, essentially kind of the downtown base. I think there are real questions about how do we get to, if we want this comprehensive autonomous vehicle future, how do we get there? Because you'll really need a Chicago Autonomous Vehicle Mobility Authority, which has got real powers, really significant powers. And I know there are some people from government transportation agencies here today, but it'd be really interesting to, the level of intentionality to change the system, for it to really be transformational, will have to be massively coordinated and steered and continuous and committed. All of things which are difficult in politics.
Okay. Marshall, how optimistic are you about the governments being able to get this together and do something good?
Well, I agree that it's definitely context specific. I think socialist governments will probably be very good at, socialist and authoritarian governments will be very good at investing in new infrastructure at a large scale, just like they are now. We are not that. And I don't know, on occasion we've been that in America, on occasion. But we have to remember, I think history is the great teacher. And so private companies built the railroads, which built Chicago. They still own them, as a matter of fact. And that's an important lesson to look at. In New York and Chicago, private companies built the subways and the L, and then they came into the public sector over time. When we talk about the challenges to the public transportation system, which we think Uber and Lyft now pose, I actually think about it differently. I think about it as a redefinition of public transit, and I actually anticipate a very plausible future in which those systems as well come into the public sector, because they need regulation. There are safety issues, there are quality control issues, there are all kinds of issues, and it's a replicable technology. Why wouldn't the CTA have its own ride-hailing system, for example? So I think it's very context-specific as well, and I think it has a lot to do with our system of government, our culture, et cetera.
Okay, it's just a cheerful outlook. I like that. What do you think?
Now for something totally different.
Okay.
I don't think that we need a big centralized approach to being able to see the advantages of it. I think that what we're really struggling with is wrapping our heads around about what's really different and transformative. And so I think what we can do is to have a very networked system that doesn't rely on, for lack of better words, an Ubers are to manage the congestion system. On the issue of the investment, I think that there are a couple of things. One is that we have a real challenge with investment in any kind of infrastructure in our country. As you pointed out, today's a big day on that front. But if we focus on the sort of high-end use cases in the high-speed area that our automotive industry is focused on, then we're going to lose a huge opportunity in something that's much less expensive. So if you think about what the development costs are for a vehicle for our OEMs, it's about $150 million. For low-speed vehicles, about $1 or $2 million. It's just a huge factor of difference. The other thing is that the probably the bigger challenge on funding is kind of an interesting one when we think about the regulatory environment. We're in an environment in Washington that is very anti-regulatory at a time where we need new regulations. Because these vehicles don't fit in the current system of the way that we look at them. They neither fit in terms of what our traditional ways of thinking of crashworthiness is, but it introduces this whole issue of what about the artificial intelligence? And we need to focus on how do we have some validation and verification of that. So what I would just sort of say is, it's not just transforming the environment and the possibilities and those things, but we have to transform the way we think about transportation and mobility.
And that's an ongoing education problem that we're all dealing with here. Thank you. I wondered if we can take some questions from, Judith is going to be Oprah here, and
This one?
yeah, so.
Actually, you're going to need this. Let's start with this.
Okay, we actually have someone right here.
Okay, apparently I'm asking the first question. My
Hi,
name is Sharon Fagan with the Shared Use Mobility Center.
Hi, Sharon.
And hi, greetings. This is great discussion. We're very happy to be co-sponsoring. And my question really is, you talked about that the transit system was built originally by private companies, but then when I think about the land use, the phenomenal land use changes that occurred after that, which was really the development of the interstate highway system, and how that in fact, was done in the public realm. And so kind of taking that into consideration, and then just how that change, the land use change, really shaped what was possible since then that we've been trying to kind of recover for those of us who care a lot about public transit. So given all that, I guess my question is, like, how do we get there? How do we maintain an ecosystem that does include public transit and autonomous vehicles, or do you see it's not,
So
it's not going to happen?
one of the other hats I wear at the university is I have a research fellowship to look at what the impacts are on the built environment. And my specific focus is on what's the new paradigm for transit-oriented development, which sort of touches on all of those kinds of things. And I think that there's a great deal of intentionality that needs to happen at the regional and local level, and a lot that's within the local and regional levels' control, but it is a public-private component of things. I think that you have an opportunity to think about mobility hubs and how you integrate these things. And when I talked about use cases that were complementary to transit, it's at this level that we make those decisions. And there are all these interesting funding mechanisms that Chris knows so much about in terms of how do you put those sorts of incentives together. But I think that there's a huge business case that in terms of density is useful, but that perhaps the intense density that we look for around a transit station might be expanded, and we could have a broader sense of what that might look like. And that's the place that I'm spending some time on my sort of academical side.
Well, I would agree with your previous statements that we have to change a lot of our thinking, and yes, of course, land use is huge. That's the main reason I'm interested in this topic. I actually don't care about robots that much in my professional life. It's not my area of expertise, and I grew up in the 80s and 90s, so I'm comfortable with technology, but I just decided at a certain point I don't care. But I recognize that history shows that whenever we have evolutions in transportation technology going back to the wheelbarrow, even though there are certain things which are unpredictable, there are certain things which are very consistent. One of them is, for example, the expansion of urban environments. Why? Because transportation technology transforms the relationship between space and time. It brings places which were farther apart closer together. Now, that, of course, is frightening to people like us in rooms like this. Why? Because we have been promoting a vision of the future, which is somehow, we hope, getting us back to more compact urban environments. I do not anticipate that happening in this future we are facing. I don't see, how, as you're saying, this kind of mobility revolution actually leads to that. And I think some of these battles we are fighting are the last battles. How do you say to people, okay, obviously there are still challenges, but when the vehicle becomes autonomous, electric, right, reasonably sustainable, right, how do you say to a mother of 3 who sits at the corner of 35th and State in the freezing cold in a hot summer, right, you shouldn't do this? How do you say that? So, there's also just a matter of experience. Every woman who rides the train or the bus has a bad experience, a bad story to tell. I ride the train and the bus. So these things will have their roles, but at the same time, I think we're seeing a future where a lot more people are gonna have a lot more choice about how they live, how they work, where they live, and where they work. And we have to actually start fighting these, not next battles, but these new battles.
I think the question of where people work is really interesting as well, because so much of this is going to be driven by the needs of employers and their decisions. And of course, we've seen a wave of kind of moves into the central city from suburbs recently. But it did strike me that the data is still showing that almost 60% of people in the region still live and work in the suburbs. I suspect, though, we're still going to get somewhere kind of polycentric, that even with the apparent freedom of kind of a super efficient kind of personal mobility system, there are other factors that are going to lead to agglomeration, without getting too academic. But there's a reason why we had shopping malls. They're not great, but everything was in the same place. There's something about that working for the economy. There's a reason why we have business parks. There's a reason why Schaumburg is there. And it's an office core, as opposed to all of that office space being kind of painted across the region in kind of an even layer. So I think we're still going to have agglomerations, and the promise of the autonomous vehicle and a centralized system and a complete allocation according to efficiency, I don't think means things are going to be an undifferentiated plane. We're still going to have places, and ultimately, come back to people. It's not just about, the machines, the data, the processing. It's kind of what are the personal choices people make? What do they seek? What do they want from themselves and their families? And ideally, what they want is a short commute, maximum flexibility, and nice places. So how do you kind of achieve that with, while we're also kind of rapidly moving into a stage where auto producers, other businesses, and it's not about big bad businesses. It's just kind of, the direction of travel is the future will largely be defined by kind of private corporate actors. And our question is, how do we want to influence that?
I'm getting some flashes of a nightmare vision from the movie WALL-E, where everyone is, all these very giant people with the giant sodas are going around in their little autonomous vehicles. Hopefully, we'll figure out a way not to do that. Alan.
I want to hire you guys. I'm going to be building a new city in the middle of nowhere, and I want to know what would the first 3 systems you would look to put in. So if you had a clean slate, if you will, where would you start? So that I have like Columbia, Maryland, an ideal community from a transportation point of view. In 25 words or less, please.
Sidewalks.
I would outlaw asphalt.
So what kind of sidewalk?
I would start with the asphalt, actually, the thing that's right next to the sidewalk. because I think that, you know, when I talk to my landscape architect team members, I've been hammering this. Asphalt. How can we kill asphalt? Can we use this technology to kill asphalt? Asphalt is terrible. We look out the window, it's everywhere. It's everywhere, from this building to the next. It's bad environmentally, it's bad aesthetically, it makes everything too hot in the summer, it stinks, but not just in the streets, but especially in the parking, and this is why parking space is in there. There's so much asphalt out there, we don't even know how much. So for me, I would start with that thing that we're all ignoring, but is everywhere. You know, the ground, not that just we drive on, not just that we walk on, but the ground that we drive on.
Dream City. How much are you going to pay?
Multimodal mobility corridors with AVs, bikes, walkers, and things we haven't imagined yet, and no asphalt.
All right, we have a consensus on getting rid of asphalt. Yes, Joe?
Well, I think that came up with a follow-up question for Marshall, but have you heard of solar frickin' roadways and that technology? But I also, my original question was, I think bringing it back to maybe now and maybe the next 10 years, what kinds of things are you seeing with sustainability, electric vehicle infrastructure, hydrogen fueling stations around the world that are being put in to help with sustainability?
Chris, would you like to take that one? Start?
Yeah, I think there's two examples. What we're seeing in China is that as new street frameworks are built, the technology has been built in, you know, in terms of, you know, the data capture, transfer. It's like, well, you have a gutter and a drain for stormwater, and, you know, you just have the data pipe as well, which is it's making the streets smart, and it's assuming a downloading of information about road using. And then the, you know, completely different context, an old medieval city that's pretty big these days in London, you know, Transport for London, the transit agency, as it rebuilds each of the streets, is also starting to input that data. And they're also building electricity charging stations as they go around as well. The working assumption is that charging will be much reduced in terms of duration, how long it takes, high speed, kind of, you know, get your battery going again. All of those technologies are moving forward massively as well.
Yeah, for me, it's more compelling to have a conversation where before we start thinking about what new technologies we can add to our streets and all of our infrastructure, I'm first interested in what technologies we can remove. Again, all the clutter that's out there, the traffic signs, the street lights, all this stuff that we've accumulated, you know, the stripes, all the stuff we've accumulated over the past 100 years to try to keep people from driving cars from killing us, right? And so that, for me, is the first step. How do we remove these things? And I think, actually, you know, when you go around the world, you talked about medieval cities. You know, I spent a month in the old city of Marrakesh this summer. It's a place where I go to. And what's amazing is you already see the kind of future that we're imagining here existing in these places, where human beings, donkeys, bicycles, mopeds, and cars all coexist in one very narrow space. And when you look down, what you see is cobblestones, just cobblestones, which work very well. You know, they drain better. They create jobs because you repair them by hand. You don't need a big machine to, you know, dig up the whole street just to, you know, replace a pothole, something like this. So I think that there are existing technologies that we could use again once we're liberated from, you know, the burdens of the automobiles that we've had for the past 100 years, which have been, frankly, dangerous. If these vehicles, if they are less dangerous, there might be some new possibilities. But I would look for what we can take out before we start putting more in.
It's hard to walk in heels on cobblestones, and it's hard to bike.
Let's get rid of heels.
Yes, are heels good for your feet?
I've been admiring your shoes, ma'am.
They're from Sears Men's Department.
Awesome.
Better get them quick.
So, you asked sort of thinking about, you said sort of internationally what we might be thinking and looking at. And I think one of the things is that we have just some tremendous opportunities right now, and we're beginning to see. So I've just finished a stint on the transition team for the new governor in Virginia. And it was so exciting to me to have electrification be a huge high priority at the top of the list for the new secretary. And even 4 years ago, that wouldn't have been one. So I think that we have opportunities to make those choices now. But when you talk about automation, the biggest issue to me is, and I'm flabbergasted when people sort of say this isn't important, but it's 37,000 people who are killed in automobile accidents, a huge amount of injuries and morbidity. And so I think that we need to think now about what our advantages are in terms of safety. So another shout out for Virginia. Virginia has done something that government's not really very good at, but they have come up with a way to have a statewide procurement for the retrofit of transit vehicles with some of the lower level automated technologies. And they've done this based on work that also is even less expensive than putting in a vehicle assist, by putting visibility in heavy vehicles so that you can see pedestrians and bikers. And I think that these are really small things that can make a huge difference. So I would talk about one of Mobility Mama's favorite pieces was on what the tech can do now for bike and ped safety. And I used some work that was done in New York City where they retrofitted 1,000 sanitation trucks with sensors, and they eliminated rear end collisions, just eliminated them. And these are things that may not be the really sexy things to think about, but you can make up the cost on that with not running over one pedestrian or one bicyclist. And if we need a compelling business case, there you have it. But I think that those are the kinds of things that I want to see and think are really exciting. And I think that we can use that sort of uniquely American spirit and uniquely civic spirit at the city level to really hold those up and move forward on them.
From the back, please. Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Leif Anderson. I'm actually a staff member for Senator Tammy Duckworth, but really just wanted to provide a little bit of comment quickly and then ask for your feedback. Right now, the Senate is considering the AV START legislation, which really creates the framework for AV vehicles, the regulatory framework at both the national and the state level. But really, and the senator sits on the Commerce Committee, which is considering this legislation. We're hopeful that this is going to be, passed through some procedural hurdles quickly and make its way to the Senate floor and a reconciliation with the House so that we can get this really going. But the reason I bring that up is to highlight the quick pace at which AV vehicles AVs are beginning to hit the scene. And within the next several years, I think we're going to see the market for them grow greatly. From your standpoint, what I was wondering is what are some of the considerations that policymakers at the national level, the state level, the local level need to be keeping in mind as this technology progresses and as the framework around the regulations takes shape?
Okay, and Kelly, what would you tell them?
Your work has just begun. That piece of legislation basically codifies our existing arrangements in ways that are good, and a division between what the federal government's responsibilities are and what state and localities' responsibilities are. What it doesn't answer are those other regulatory kinds of questions and issues about transparency. So it doesn't answer the fact that NHTSA does not have the technical capability to move forward on regulations or on evaluating the safety exemptions. It doesn't answer that we need to think differently about the collision standards for these new lightweight vehicles. It doesn't answer how do we understand where and how the AI is working. And it's not just about money, it's also about will and a focus on it. So congratulations on getting it done, roll up your sleeves, not just through the appropriations process, but through the oversight process.
Yeah, I'm not a policy person, but in my research, one of the most interesting studies I found was by a University of Pennsylvania professor whose name I'm forgetting right now, but a professor of planning. He was looking at several of the largest metropolitan planning agencies around the country and asking them what they were doing to prepare for connected and autonomous vehicles. And he kept getting the same answer, nothing. And so he changed his research question. Well, why not? Since you're charged with looking outward 20 years, right? Why not? And they basically gave the same answer. Because our funding from the federal government prohibits us from making recommendations about anything for which we don't have any data, right? So they don't have data to deal with this issue, so therefore they can't actually deal with it in their 20-year plans. This is a problem. So we've gotten into a situation where our planning agencies are inherently, and in many cases, necessarily risk averse. But this is a catch-22 in this particular situation. So I think looking at that, at every level, city planning agencies, metropolitan planning agencies, how we give them more space to actually think about this in advanced ways, I think is going to be important.
Can I make a huge, quick shout out on this? So Jennifer Hannigan is sitting here in the audience. She and I have been working on a playbook for cities and counties and MPOs on this question. And you've really hit the nub on the head that the whole thing is structured toward doing this long-range planning. And the work that Jennifer's been doing, along with a lot of other people, is to think about how do we break out of that by using scenario planning, both for changing the assumptions and the models,
Yeah, that's what we
but
use.
also in moving forward. And you don't have to have a change in federal funding to get there. But at any rate, so Jennifer and I recorded the first 2 sessions of a new podcast that we'll be sending to all of you that's going to be focusing on these kinds of tools for planners, and we need a really glamorous name, so.
Yeah, completely agreed. I mean, we use scenario planning as the basis for our work as well.
Again, I'm not familiar with the details of kind of the policy push on this, but what I'd encourage is that this doesn't become an example of sort of trying to catch up and regulate something that we assume is just coming. Again, it's back to the question of intentionality. How does this fit with our mobility system for our cities and urban areas and country as a whole? And if there is going to be kind of major investment in kind of political capital and intellectual capital in figuring this one out, we need to figure out how to get all of our transit systems into the 21st century as well as our kind of personal mobility systems. And I think also critically, just understanding it's not all about us as consumers. Again, another steady state issue that we may assume, but the absolute transformation in freight is happening at the same time. And so this isn't just about how do we drive to work and to the mall, it's about how is this whole thing going to operate? And I think that's the challenge, and this is the once in a century decision point. So, we should kind of, get the resources to really understand those decisions, be intentional.
We're just about out of time, so I can take one more question. Yes, ma'am.
Well, okay, to pick up on freight, which is perfect, I've been thinking a lot about trucks. And there's a couple of stories that came out recently. One, there is shaping up to be a big strike, potentially, at UPS. The Teamsters are really against, self-driving vehicles, drones, that kind of thing, and they're taking a pretty line in the sand stance on this. And the other was a study that came out that said we're saving energy because people aren't going out as much. So we're getting, instead of going to the mall, this was in the New York Times, not, so this was a real story. So, you have changing behaviors. We have stuff coming to us via Amazon. So trucks is a really interesting area, like the trains from the 19th, early 20th century. Those are kind of owned by companies. They're making big moves looking at hydrogen, making big moves in all of these different directions. Is that where this starts?
Okay, how are we dealing with freight, with people, and with the people who drive it?
Well, I think we're probably, again, not dealing with it. We're kind of catching up, and we're taking a wait and see, and then we'll figure it out and kind of regulate it, because this is something where, the tech companies, the corporations, logistics companies, Amazon is essentially a logistics company. It moves everybody else's products around, amongst other things that it does. I think it's a major issue, and those are the businesses with major fleets are always going to be pushing this because they're saving costs. They're saving labor costs, energy costs, and their data and logistics capability is all about getting the most efficient route around. But I think your point about people not going out as much, but out is coming in. And so that means the same amount of movement. In fact, it means more and more complex movements because you've got the supplier now has to deliver to 100 places instead of one. So I think we're in catch-up mode. And I think where we're probably heading is some kind of hybrid system and a hybrid network, and it's going to be a bit like Marrakesh. I think Marrakesh is it's a really good analogy. And this morning I was talking with somebody about kind of like how you get to work if everybody's got their own individual little vehicle. And we end up talking about New Delhi with the rickshaws and the putt-putts, where it's like one person per vehicle. They've got a driver. But if you look at kind of how those traffic circles and that movement works and how they actually deliver people to office districts, it's fascinating. So I think we're going to end up, those are the metaphors of kind of where we're heading, but we've got an opportunity to, kind of shape it. This is our world. We shape this ourselves. There's no natural order to human transportation. We're the decision makers, so it's kind of on us.
Yeah, I mean, since the advent of the train and the telegraph, there's been this fear that no one will ever leave the house again, yet we still do, right? I mean, ironically, we're all still sitting here in a room. We could have done this over the internet or on a podcast. So I think people will always leave the house because we just do. So that's great. When we talk about delivery, and that's what I was showing is that video, which we have the full version of it on our website. For me as an architect and an urban designer, yeah, as you were saying earlier, I think it's about a coevolution of the truck driver. I think there will still be people with these vehicles. They'll be doing other things. How do we retrain them? So for me, that's not the issue I'm focused on. I'm actually looking at the warehouses and the intermodal yards, right? What is going to happen with all of that infrastructure when you don't need things and you don't want things sitting around in these big, ugly metal boxes, right? What happens with all that space? What do we do with all that existing infrastructure? Do we just leave it to rot? Or how do we reimagine it for other kinds of uses? What is the life of those places? Most of those places which take up a large part of the urban territory, but none of us ever see up close. We just see it when we're taking off and landing from O'Hare or passing by it. So for me, those are the really critical, pressing questions about this technology, in addition to, other people are going to handle the labor disputes. I'm an architect. That's not my area of expertise. But and there will be labor disputes. But these land use issues are massive and I think affect all of us.
On the labor issue, I think this is a good example of where the automation question is highlighting an underlying other problem, which is that we haven't dealt with the gig economy very well, and we need to figure out how to make healthcare benefits and pension benefits portable. And that if a strike at UPS helps drive that question, I'm for it. And I think that I've done a lot of looking at the impacts that Lyft and Uber have had, and it's the same issue. But to an issue, and there is a lot that the city can do in terms of thinking through the workforce issues and working through those, but there's something that's a little nearer and dearer to my heart, so when I'm not wonking out on these other issues, it's that we ought to be able to free up a whole lot of land from parking.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And long before you even talk about the ugly warehouses, we've paved over the country with parking.
Yeah.
And someone who wasn't necessarily a very easy person to get along with, but was a real visionary, his last public appearance was to protest parking requirements. And that was Steve Jobs in Cupertino, where he spent more money on parking than he did on office space. And he's put together a campus that is walkable and bikeable and connected to transit and has paid transit, private transit coming to it. But he still spent more money on parking, and it's wasted. And we need to figure out how to put the drivers for releasing that land value for everyone in place. And that's really to me the now in the next 10 years issue on land use. And if autonomous vehicles drive that one along, as it were, then I'm for it.
Okay. All right, that's all we have time for. I wanted to thank Kelly Coyner, Marshall Brown, and Christopher Hall for having such a wonderful discussion.